amazing fact emerges that when you study this period, that for the 15 years before the meeting on Jekyll Island, these groupings of which we're speaking had come together increasingly in joint ventures. They were learning how to avoid competition between themselves. They knew they couldn't knock each other out. They had tried that. It was too costly. Now it was time to come together. And what happened on Jekyll Island is that they formed a banking cartel, and they called it the Federal Reserve System. An amazing fact that all these years we've had something which most people have thought was a government operation of some kind or another. We're told it was a creation to protect the people, to stabilize the economy, and it's a cartel. And the purpose of a cartel is to enhance the profit structure of the members of the cartel. Period.
So in 1910, William Howard Taft was president, and the 6 gentlemen who were there, Nelson Aldrich, Republican whip in the Senate, Henry Davison, senior partner of J.P. Morgan, A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong of J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg, partner representing the Rothschilds and Warburgs in Europe. And you say that in here that they represented essentially 1/4 of the entire wealth of the world.
Of the entire world. Incredible statement. That's not my appraisal, but that was the opinion of the journalists at the time who were writing about these people, not in connection with the Federal Reserve, but they were prominent bankers, and they talked about the Jekyll Island group, for example, and then these bankers in particular, and the investment houses of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and so forth. But they said these men represented directly through the power that they held in their own hands, and indirectly through the money that was concentrated in the investment firms, like the insurance companies and the banking companies. Put it all together, they said it was 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. And you know, that concentration of wealth has only increased since then.
Well, you asked the question in your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, what is the Federal Reserve, and what is your answer?
Well, what it is, it's a cartel. It's not a government agency. It has the appearance of it being a government agency, and they went to great lengths to give it that facade. It does have the power of government because Congress voted to give the power of enforcement to it. But in its essence, underneath it, it's a cartel. It's nothing different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel or sugar cartel. It happens to be a banking cartel. They got together, they drew up the rules and regulations for their own industry, to self-regulate their own industry is what cartels do. And then they sent it to Congress, and they took off the label at the top that said banking cartel, and they erased that, and they said Federal Reserve Act. Congress passed it into law, and that's why we think it's a government agency, is because if you don't obey the rules that they set down for their own industry, you go to prison. And so it looks like a government agency. But basically the answer to your question is, it's a banking cartel.
Well, there's been some movements to combat this globalist totalitarian network, which has not only financed communist revolutions around the world, such as in Russia,
we need to be
China,
going back and looking
and
at
more
Germany.
recently in South Africa, which were all triggered by engineered social uprisings aimed to remove existing power structures using class warfare and amplifying socioeconomic and racial tensions enforced by a banker-controlled media. We can see the same pattern played out in America today, where manufactured civil unrest is used to erase history and promote cultural Marxism. In a nation which already promotes falsehoods in schools, starting from its name, which was not really based on the explorer Amerigo Vespucci, whose authentic name was actually Alberigo Vespucci, who only changed his name to Amerigo after his voyages to the Americas. In other words, Amerigo came from America and not the other way around. Not only was there an existing tribe in Nicaragua called Americ, whose root word was the ancient name for the land used by the natives of Peru, also known to the Maya civilization and attributed to the great feathered serpent creator deity, which they called Kukulkan, a deity which also had an equivalent by the Aztec civilization. According to Manly P. Hall, in his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, quote, "These children of the sun adore the plumed serpent, who is the messenger of the sun. He was the god Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, Cucamet in Quiche, and in Peru he was called Amaru. From the latter name comes our word America. Amaruca is literally translated land of the plumed serpent. The priests of this flying dragon, from their chief center, they once ruled both Americas. One of their strong centers was Guatemala, and of their order was the author of the book called Popol Vuh. Many Mesoamerican and Native Indian tribes also record in their oral traditions encounters and conflicts with giants, or at least very tall people in the past. I also covered this topic in several videos, showing documentation regarding many discoveries of giant skeletons, which have been published in newspapers, and then seemingly forgotten to history, except for mythology or mentions of giants in the Bible. In many biblical interpretations, the serpent is synonymous with Lucifer, the fallen angel thrown down by God, which literally translates to light bearer, a symbol which can be found in many parts of the ancient pre-Christian world. In his book, The Occult Connection to the Hidden Race, author Ken Hoodall proposes that, quote, "Then perhaps the land of the plumed serpent may also be known as the land of Lucifer."
Now we understand the
Concluding
Statue of
that
Liberty's
America
meaning.
means
It's
the
mythos.
land of Lucifer. While this interpretation may sound like a real stretch for many, it's an interesting concept when considered from the perspective of an interview that I recently stumbled upon, suggested to me by one of my subscribers, which uncovered some interesting details regarding the secretive meeting on Jekyll Island and events that led up to the creation of the Federal Reserve. The gentleman being interviewed is Tim Bentz, and the host of the show is Rob Skiba from a broadcast on Blog Talk Radio titled Canaanite Altars and the Federal Reserve. I'll leave a link to the full interview in the description, but now let's listen to a brief excerpt, and I'll leave it to the listener to draw their own conclusions.
Listen up, folks. Listen good.
I knew something about Jekyll Island. I had looked at some of the financial issues in the 80s and 90s. I was looking at some of the spiritual applications to financial things, but I really was not up to speed on the history of Jekyll Island. I had just heard it from something. I'd not even read, the book that's called The Creature of Jekyll Island. I'd not even read that book, but I was aware of something about Jekyll Island and financial stuff. So I went in my brother's house, got my computer out, and I just, got on the internet and typed in Jekyll Island. It's like, what's going on with Jekyll Island? And so I discovered when I got online that the Jekyll Island Club, which was this historical
Old world building there.
multi-millionaires country club that had been built in the turn of the century, it had just been remodeled and reopened. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. When I got to the hotel, it was about 9 o'clock at night. And so I went in the restaurant and had a good meal, and went to my room and got some rest. And the next morning I went down for breakfast, and a different lady was at the desk, but she had a note for me and said that I had an appointment arranged with the museum director, and that he was blocking out most of the day to spend with me. So I had my breakfast, and then I went over to meet with him. So I go meet with the museum gentleman. His name is John, and when I go meet with him, I just introduced myself. I told him a little bit about who I was and what I do. We started talking. He was, of course, started out talking about the financial stuff, because this Jekyll Island is where the Federal Reserve banking system was birthed and conceived. And at one time, when it was functioning in the 1900s up to the 20s and 30s, some say 1/3, some say 2/3 of the world's wealth would vacation on that island. It was the highest conglomeration of wealth in a single place, very anywhere in the world back in the turn of the century. And so it just seems like a little island that's not anything significant at all now, but it's amazing to see the financial side of the history of that spot. And so I'm sitting there looking at some of the things that he's telling, just thinking about some of the things he's telling me. We went out, walked around, and he showed me some of the cottages that had been restored, and the club itself, and the tennis courts, and they had a pier where the boats would come up, and he's just kind of showing me the grounds, and then we go to the museum, and he's talking a lot about the financial stuff and the guys that built it, and each cottage was marked and named. Some of them had been restored, some of them didn't exist anymore, but they had like a sign that this is where this one was, and that one was built by J.P. Morgan, that one was Rockefeller's, and that one was they had each one of them named. Well, they're all kind of native names, and then they're all got some kind of plaque on who the financial model